Escalating airstrikes in Sudan's war, with the army trying to break RSF control of most of Khartoum and neighboring cities. Almost 6 months into the fighting, both the conflict's warring generals insist they will fight to the finish. I'm Hazem Sika, and today's newsmaker is Sudan. Indiscriminate airstrikes and shelling aren't new in Sudan's civil war. But in recent weeks, residents of the greater Khartoum area say their city has been reduced to a battlefield. Earlier this month, dozens were killed in a drone attack on an open-air market, and a landmark building was engulfed by fire. After escaping a siege in the capital, the head of the army, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, pledged a decisive victory instead of heading to peace talks in Saudi Arabia. His rival, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, or Hemeti, says the RSF will fight to the finish. So why have the warring generals seemingly hardened their positions against each other? And what will it take to end a conflict that has already killed 5,000 people and displaced over 7 million?
The UN says Sudan has become the world's most dangerous and complex environment to deliver aid after almost 6 months of conflict. Witnesses say last weekend saw the most violent battles in the capital Khartoum since the war began. Key institutions were targeted, including the Justice Ministry. An iconic tower was also engulfed in fire, with the warring sides trading blame for the attacks. Simmering tensions between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary group Rapid Support Forces plunged into full-scale fighting in April. Thousands of people have been killed, and ethnically motivated attacks have ramped up in West Darfur. Reports suggest there are at least 13 mass graves around the restive region's capital, El Janina. Human rights groups have accused both sides of committing war crimes.
Civilians and civilian infrastructure, including health facilities, places of worship, water and electricity installations, have been targeted, damaged, and destroyed. There have been shocking accounts of widespread rape and sexual violence. There must be accountability for these crimes, as well as medical and psychosocial support for survivors.
The conflict has displaced 7.1 million people, including 1 million who have fled to the neighboring countries. Aid organizations are struggling to cope with the sheer number of refugees due to insufficient funds. The UN says that the fighting has brought healthcare in the country to its knees, leaving many vulnerable to epidemic disease. In the last 4 months, refugee agencies have reported more than 3,000 suspected measles and 500 cholera cases, along with outbreaks of dengue fever and malaria. More than 1,200 refugee children under the age of 5 have died from disease and malnutrition.
UNICEF fears that many thousands of newborns will die between now and the end of the year. 330,000 children will be born in Sudan between October and December. They and their mothers, as you heard, do need skilled delivery care, rather in a country where millions are trapped, millions are lacking access to those basic healthcare services, and there are of course grave shortages of medical supplies. Such care is becoming less and less likely by the day.
In August, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan moved his operations to Port Sudan after being trapped in army headquarters in Khartoum for months. The city has the country's only functioning airport and hosts UN missions. Burhan has also made several foreign trips to drum up diplomatic support. In the past few weeks, he has visited several countries including Egypt, Qatar, and Eritrea. And on Wednesday, he touched down in New York to address the UN General Assembly.
We in the armed forces reassure the Sudanese people and the whole world that we are continuing on the path to complete what we started earlier in this transitional phase, to defeat the rebellion and to move forward with our previous commitments of transitioning to a democratic rule.
RSF leader Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo says he will start consultations to form local authorities in areas under his control, a move that could result in rival governments.
Our priority must be to end the war and to unite Sudan. We must not allow the formation of a war government in Port Sudan. Establishing such a government means that We are heading to scenarios that happened in other countries, where two parties control different areas in one country.
While the scale of human suffering and destruction increases, no side seems closer to a victory in a conflict that is destabilizing the entire region.
Well, to discuss this and more, let's go to our panel. Joining me now from London is David Otto. He is the Director for Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies. Amgad Eltayeb is the former Deputy Chief of Staff to former Sudanese Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok and the Executive Director of Fikra for Studies and Development, a public policy think tank. He joins us from Cairo. And in Washington, D.C., we have Cameron Hudson, an Africa Program Senior Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. I want to start by asking all three of you this simple question, and that is, I mean, obviously, at this point, we are very far from any sort of an end to the fighting in Sudan. But I want to ask you, if there is a solution to this conflict, what is it going to look like, according to you? So let me ask that first to you, Amgad, in Cairo.
Thank you very much, Hazem. I think any solution should be very clear that it cannot be built over what happened in the past. Those who participated in making this war cannot be rewarded for their bad deeds. Any solution needs to take any solutions that can take place need to have the elements of reforming the army and depoliticizing it, and in the same time dismantling the militia, the RSF, completely, and ending its institutional existence. And by ending its institutional existence, I'm not only talking about its military presence and its forces, but also the RSF. It's engulfing a huge economic and politically corrupt empire. This also needs to be disbanded for any solutions that can maintain stability and peace and return to democracy in Sudan.
David, what does a lasting end to the fighting there look like to you?
Well, I think there are two stages to this. The first stage is to stop the bleeding, and that would entail making sure that we can have both General al-Burhan of the Sudanese Armed Forces and General Hemeti to reconcile and go back to what appeared to be some level of coordination and collaboration between the two forces. That will stop the fighting, which is very important. And I think the next stage would be to arrive at an architecture that would provide for a democratic process to return to Sudan. And then, of course, we can talk about a unified army, which, of course, it's the main cause of this crisis. But it has to be within that stage, within those stages, you know, for us to get to any point whereby anything that looks like a solution could be seen on the horizon.
Cameron Hudson, how do you see a solution to this?
Well, I think maybe what I'll do is point out what hasn't been pointed out before. And from the international perspective, I think one of the challenges is that Washington is looking for a side to back, and neither of the warring sides merit the backing of the international community, because they both committed these horrific crimes in the conduct of this war. The SAF has a long history of brutal treatment in the country. So Washington and Brussels and London, neither of them want to see either of these forces rule the country. And so that leaves us short of answers, though, because on the civilian side, the political side, there is no group, there's no organization, there's no candidate to back to be a credible alternative right now either. We have seen the Forces for Freedom and Change divided and infighting over these past few months. We've seen them co-opted by members of the Rapid Support Forces in some cases. And so I think the international community is caught between these warring parties, not wanting to back them, wanting to back a civilian outcome, but not having a clear path forward in how to do that. And so I think the thing that one of the things the international community needs to work on is helping to coalesce the political coalitions and the civilian voices in the country so that they have a platform from which to build a governance structure that the international community can get behind, and that will delegitimize these military actors who are the dominant political actors for the time being.
Well, let's bring up the international aspect of this then to Amgad. How do you see international and regional players in this conflict? Are they simply making it worse? Is there any scenario in which they could bring a solution to this?
I think that I will answer your question by commenting on what David said in his answer to your question about the mistaken perspective that the international community is looking to this crisis in Sudan and attempting to reach reconciliation and collaboration between the two generals in order to stop the war. I think this was the mistake that happened since the coup of the 25th of October 2021, that the international community continued to cuddle the two generals and feed their lust for power until they start fighting over the spoils of their coup. Right now, the international community is trying to do the same mistake, is repeating the same mistake in Jeddah by trying to reach another deal of distributing power and authority between two bad, evil sides. This war is between two evil sides, and those two evil sides should not be rewarded for their crimes. We see the army SAF with its long history of dictatorship and coup, and we see the RSF in its real face as a fascist organization that's incompatible with the life in Sudan, with stability or with peace or democracy. Any attempt to restore these two bad sides to the political scene as normal political actors would be just paving the way for another delayed war in Sudan. What's needed for the international community is to back the Sudanese people. Yes, as Cameron said, the civilians are divided, but this is the nature of democracy. Civilians will always disagree, and they will manage their disagreement without arms. I think the challenge right now is how to get weapons and arms outside the political scene in Sudan. And within the current international framework, where the UN is completely irrelevant and becoming more and more irrelevant, and as Cameron also pointed out, the big Western capitals led by DC is totally in a loss, and dealing with the situation in Sudan in a very chaotic way, not only in Sudan, but I think all over Africa. I think the Sudanese are on their own right now.
David, Otto, where do you see the international role in all of this? And is there a risk as well that this conflict, the longer it goes on, risks spilling over and further risks destabilizing the region?
Well, I think the biggest issue in terms of the role of regional or international parties has been the level of disunity. Every party, some sort of chasing its own interest. We've seen that there hasn't been any comprehensive or collaborative effort by various international stakeholders. And, that has led to a scenario whereby each party comes into the fray backing a particular side. And what I've said from the beginning of this crisis is that before it gets to the point at which it is at this moment, quite dangerous, very desperate, and needs surging at breakneck speed. I think what we need is an international community that comes on a single platform, not what we're seeing, where Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the US, countries like the AU, the US, everyone has his own plans in terms of how they want to see this war end. But it doesn't take away from the fact that these interests are real. We know that, for example, Egypt and Ethiopia, have an issue over the dam. So there are so many complicated interventions, and the problem that I think the international community has is that it does not have one voice, and it does present itself so much like the fighting parties as well, where the Sudanese armed forces, the leadership, and that of the RSF, seems to lack a voice. So we kind of have four parties to a war here. Two being those who are involved in the fighting, and the different parties being the international community involved in various interests. And that's where I think the major issue is.
Okay, I want to step back a little bit and try to understand how things got to this point, because we should remind ourselves, of course, that the RSF and the Sudanese army were once on the same side. So let me put this to you, Cameron, Hudson. How did this bitter military rivalry develop, and why has it come to this?
Well, I think that the rivalry developed, it's part of the origin story of the creation of the RSF. The RSF was created during the war in Darfur as a more mobile fighting unit to do the dirty work that the SAF could not do or did not want to do from Khartoum. I think what we have seen, though, in the last decade is the growth of the RSF, really because of the entrepreneurial leadership of General Dagalo Hameti, who has taken a regional tribal militia group and turned it into a formidable fighting force. He did that by, lending the force out as a mercenary army. He did it by developing gold fields, taking over property across Darfur, and buying himself an army and heavy weapons, and developing foreign relationships with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, so that he became a rival political figure and a rival security figure in the country. So I think the rise of the RSF over the past decade, frankly, under the nose of Sudan's army. They watched this happen. They enabled it. And then were caught, by surprise when Bashir fell and Hemeti came for the first time to take up residence in the capital, Khartoum, and started maneuvering as a political figure, and in many ways outmaneuvering the SAF as a political figure. I think that is the origin of this rivalry. It goes back many years, but obviously came to a head in the absence of the dictator Bashir, who was able to play these forces against each other. When they were not able, when there was no buffer between them, we see the result of that.
And Amgad, part of the fallout from the fighting that we've seen in Khartoum is the reports of renewed conflict flaring up again in West Darfur. How concerning is that? And because that's also connected with the RSF, isn't it?
It's not only connected with the RSF, but as I said, the RSF is a fascist organization, and part of this fascism is their racism and their delusion of supremacy over the other ethnic groups in Darfur. What happened in West Darfur was a massacre, was a war crime that committed against the Masalid community, and involved also the political assassination of many of our Masalid leaders, including the late Khamis al-Bakr, the governor of West Darfur. The international community decided to set a blind eye on the fascist nature of the RSF for a very long time. But it's now coming to hunt the Sudanese. I think the 2019 agreement that established the transition in Sudan, it was short-sighted in many aspects, but I think the biggest one of them was the acceptance and the normalization of the existence of the RSF. Later, the coup that took place on the 25th of October 2021, which was conducted by alliance of the RSF and SAF, both General Burhan and Hemeti, took arms together to depose the transitional civilian government, and now they are fighting over this austerity that or this power that they stole. Sudan has a civil war, and this civil war is not only happening in Khartoum. It's happening in Khartoum. It's happening in Darfur. It's happening in Kordofan. It's happening everywhere. And the quicker the world recognizes this, that this is not a small regional war in part of Sudan, but it's a civil war that's increasingly taking tribal and regional situations, the quicker that we can reach a solution.
And of course, what we haven't talked about up to this point is the humanitarian disaster that is unfolded as a result of this conflict and is continuing to unfold. So, David, Otto, let me put that to you. How do you even begin to address all of that, particularly when the fighting is still going on, and it's incredibly difficult to even get aid to the people who need it most?
You're right. I mean, of course, this is an issue that is currently being discussed at the United Nations level in New York, ongoing. They are talking about the increase in humanitarian support, which is required. They are talking about refugees, the breakdown of law and order, but also the level of destruction of critical infrastructure that we continue to see as we speak. It's a crisis that, as my colleague said, has spread not just within Khartoum, but across areas like Darfur, the Kordofan region. We also have a scenario whereby regional states, including the likes of Chad, Central African Republic, Egypt, Ethiopia, even South Sudan, are having the impact of the war. And that is why we've always called, in the very earliest stage, that the idea of trying to paint one side, or the RSF or the Sudanese armed force, as the bad guys, and the other side as the good guy, is one of the key reasons why we continuously have a conflict which is deepening. Both sides, do not seem to have the legitimacy when it comes to, running democratic system is concerned. They are all beneficiaries of a military coup, and therefore, what we want to see is at the first stage, try, because of course, we know that both sides are fighting. Try as much as possible to reconcile both sides so that we can stop the fighting and move towards a stage whereby we can start talking about instituting a democratic process, one that would allow for all the humanitarian conflict, the humanitarian impact to be able to lower. Because at this point in time, the crisis is, at a very dangerous stage. And we want to see that with a committed and united international community, and of course, a voice that comes from the Sudanese people, calling for an end to these hostilities between the two sides.
Amgad, what are the chances of that happening? How do you, given everything that's been discussed now, what are the prospects for a solution to this? I mean, how do you see this playing out over the next few months?
I just want to comment over the humanitarian crisis in Sudan and compare it to what's happening in other areas in the world. Sudan now is the biggest country of that's having a displacement people. 7.1 million IDPs are now in Sudan. 5.5 million of them were displaced after the 15th of October, the date of the eruption of the war. From the 40 million population of Sudan, there is 24.6 million are in dire need of humanitarian assistance, and 19.4 million of the Sudanese population are in the risk of famine. There is outbreak of malaria, cholera, dengue fever, and other hemorrhagic fever that's risking the life of over 5 million Sudanese children. Cases of rape have been documented by independent sources committed by the RSF in Khartoum and in Darfur and in other areas of Sudan. And there is huge disinformation campaign that the RSF is launching to cover its crimes and create an alternative narrative about the war in Sudan. The Digital Forensic Lab of the Atlantic Council have revealed networks of hundreds of thousands of fake Twitter accounts that's glorifying the RSF. The world have turned a blind eye in a disgraceful manner to the humanitarian crisis in Sudan, when we see that since the eruption of the war, only 25% of the funding needed to the humanitarian aid to Sudan have been available. There is a deficit of 75% of humanitarian need to Sudan.
All right.
The solution will only start, I agree with David, that with the international community to come to a single point and a single platform to address the crisis and to stop this competition and forum shopping that's taking place right now.
All right, we've only got about a minute left, so
can I just add that?
Yeah, go ahead briefly.
I just want to make it clear that the disinformation and misinformation campaign that my colleague is mentioning is being carried out by all sides. I don't want us to single out the RSF, because we have seen clearly that both sides have carried out a disinformation and misinformation campaign.
All right, we're gonna have to leave it there. Thanks very much to all three of you. Appreciate your time. It's been a good discussion. David, Otto, Amgad, Fareid, Eltayeb, and Cameron Hudson. Thanks very much for being on the Newsmakers. And thank you for watching. Remember, you can follow us on X and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Hazem Seeker. We'll see you next time.